There are no borders in the warp, only the memory of where they once were. Across the void, 1,000 worlds flicker like candles trembling before a storm, their souls whispering through the Imperium. Somewhere beyond that storm, a single planet screams without sound. Oceans boil, mines rupture, and cities melt into living reflections of despair. The warp does not arrive as an army or a plague, it arrives as hunger given form. It begins with a whisper in the dreams of astropaths, a distortion in the choir, a shimmer in the sky where no light should be. Then the veil tears and reality bleeds. What follows is not invasion nor conquest. It is consumption. Civilizations vanish as though swallowed by thought itself, their names reduced to echoes in the Emperor's light. In the galaxy of the 41st millennium, damnation is not a myth. It is a physics, and still humanity dares to reach for the stars. If the light of the Imperium still reaches you, if the Emperor's voice has not yet been drowned by the storm, then let your vigilance be your offering. Strengthen this signal, share this transmission so that others may learn what waits beyond the veil, and subscribe your faith to the flame that still burns on Terra. Only together can memory outlast the warp. It began as a murmur in the void. At first, no one noticed. In the endless hum of the Imperium's starways, silence itself was rare, a sound that could be mistaken for peace. But aboard the pilgrim vessel St. Irenaeus of Calyx Reach, silence took shape. The ship's choir, 50 psychers bound in sanctified chains, fell still mid-litany, their eyes rolled white, voices fading into a void deeper than sleep. The navigator felt it first, not as fear, but as absence. The currents of the Imperium no longer obeyed. The great warp currents that had flowed with the Astronomican's beacon began to curl back on themselves, forming eddies of memory, whirlpools of forgotten thought. The ship drifted through the storm like a bead of dust on a dying breath. In the command sanctum, Captain Helbrecht knelt before the gilded Aquila, reciting the oath of safe transit. His voice trembled, not from faithlessness but from the growing pressure in the walls, metal plates groaning as though the hull were remembering something old and sorrowful. A flicker passed across the hololith display, not a vessel, not a signal, an echo. It repeated the ship's own coordinates, slightly delayed, as if the void itself had begun to speak in reflections. The Vox officer crossed himself and whispered, "The sea answers." No one laughed. Days stretched, or perhaps hours. The clocks began to contradict one another, each marking a different rhythm. A servitor recited maintenance mantras until its voice box melted into static. The astropathic choir began to dream collectively. They spoke of a garden of glass, of roots that sang beneath a sun that was also a wound. The navigator locked the bridge doors and drew the shades on her third eye, muttering that the Astronomican's light had become folded. What that meant, no one could say. But the pilgrims, thousands of them packed in the lower holds, felt it too. Their prayers grew more frantic. Some said the Emperor's light flickered not because it dimmed, but because something vast had passed between it and them. On the 5th rotation, the St. Irenaeus dropped out of the warp. Not by choice. The Geller field failed without alarm. One moment it was humming, the next it was simply gone, like breath leaving a corpse. The void beyond the hull turned translucent, alive with motion. Shapes moved there, too slow for eyes, too precise for madness. A single astropath, still conscious, began to scream a hymn of inversion, the canticle of empty thrones. Those who heard it felt their memories turn inside out. Some remembered things they had not lived. Some forgot their own names. When the emergency klaxons finally blared, it was already too late. Only fragments would later be recovered. The Vox recording of Captain Helbrecht's final transmission. "We are not lost. We are remembered differently." The St. Irenaeus was found months later by a Mechanicus recovery fleet, orbiting a barren rock where no warp route should have led. The hull bore no breach marks. Every airlock was sealed. Inside, there were no bodies, only dust, shaped faintly like footprints that led toward the chapel and ended there. Across the segmentum, similar whispers began to surface. Minor anomalies, the administratum called them. Navigators complained of false light. Astropaths heard prayers answering themselves. Tech priests of Mars observed faint static patterns aligning with the frequency of human emotion. At first, the Inquisition silenced such reports, branding them as contagion of panic. But the pattern grew. On hive worlds, entire manufactorums would halt for an instant, every servo and cog freezing not by failure but by obedience, as though listening for something. Ships passing through the Hadraxian corridor recorded faint rhythmic pulses in the warp. Not random, but syllabic. It was as if the void had begun to form language. On the shrine world of Pyron, the first open tear appeared. Witnesses described it as a bruise in the sky, purple, pulsing, almost beautiful. Pilgrims fell to their knees, believing it a sign of divine revelation. The ecclesiarchy sent choirs to sing beneath it. The air grew warm, the hymns distorted. Those who sang longest began to glow faintly, their veins illuminated from within. When they collapsed, they did not decay. Their skin became translucent, their bones faintly luminescent. The priest declared it a miracle. The Ordo Hereticus declared it an infection. By the time judgment was rendered, the bruise in the sky had spread across half the planet's horizon, and the hymns could be heard without singers. From the orbiting defense stations, the Adeptus Arbites watched as cities below began to shimmer. Streets seemed to fold and unfold as if the planet itself were breathing. Vox transmissions carried the sound of weeping metal and laughter beneath it. The Arbites fired orbital bombardments to cleanse the heresy, but the explosions never reached the surface. The fire froze mid-detonation, trapped in a silence that defied time. When contact was lost, the system was marked exterminatus pending. But the order was never executed. The fleet simply turned away, unwilling to record what they saw. The warp had not invaded Pyron. It had become it. Even the Inquisition grew hesitant. To name the phenomenon was to risk contagion, for the warp's first weapon is always comprehension. The Ordo Malleus archivists used new terminology: mimetic incursion, conceptual corrosion, psionic recursion. But among the lower ranks, acolytes, adepts, scribes, the word whisper storm took hold. It spread in secret Vox messages, graffiti in supply tunnels, prayers scratched on data slates. They said the storm didn't come from the warp alone. It came from the minds of men who tried to understand it. Each theory fed it. Each record gave it shape. The warp was listening, and it learned the language of fear. Still, the Imperium endured as it always had, through routine, faith, and sanctioned ignorance. The Administratum decreed that new documents could only reference the phenomenon as localized atmospheric distortion. The ecclesiarchy rebranded survivors, testimonies as visions granted by the Emperor. The Astra Militarum sent regiments to worlds no longer on any star chart, purging shadows that might once have been cities. Even as reality frayed, the bureaucracy strengthened its rituals. Faith became armor, ignorance became shield. Yet beneath it all, the warp whispered still softly, rhythmically, almost kindly. And then came the day the Astronomican flickered. Just once, barely perceptible. But to those who navigate the void, that single pulse was enough to birth panic on a scale unseen since the Great Rift first opened. Every ship, every choir, every soul attuned to the light of Terra felt the same sensation, as if the Emperor himself had turned his gaze away for half a heartbeat. Across the galaxy, 1 billion prayers rose in the same instant, some out of devotion, some out of terror. That was when the veil truly began to crack. The first world to vanish without trace was not a fortress, nor a shrine, nor a place of power. It was a quiet agri-colony named Erelin 9, lost among the mist lanes of the Ultima Segmentum. It had no history worth recording, no relics, no strategic value. But when the last transmission reached the Administratum relay on Carthane Prime, it was enough to shatter 1,000 sleep cycles. A single voice, female, calm, distorted by distance, spoke 3 words: "The harvest sings." Then silence. Every attempt to re-establish contact failed. Long-range picked captures showed only a blur of motion over the continent's fields. Rows of wheat twisting in perfect spirals, forming patterns that pulsed like a heartbeat. When the Navy patrol arrived, the world had gone dark. Its orbit was littered with frozen dust that sensors misread as organic matter. The Mechanicus declared the planet inverted in phase, whatever that meant. No survivors were found, and yet, the patrol's auspex recorded rhythmic pulses in the static, matching the cadence of human breath. The Inquisition sent observers, cloaked as merchants and miners, to the nearby systems. They spoke of dreams shared between worlds, oceans turning upward, moons that sang, cities that whispered their citizens' names backwards. One report described a child born speaking fluent High Gothic, reciting an unfamiliar catechism that ended with the phrase, "I remember when you were light." Each of these accounts was sealed, redacted, erased. Yet the data ghosts of those records persisted in the noosphere, spreading like infection among the cogitators. The warp was learning not just to devour, but to archive. On Forge World Chilax Theta, Magos Zenith ordered the construction of a new kind of Geller lattice, a network of machines designed to stabilize the barrier between real and unreal by converting fear itself into energy. The Mechanicus priest called it the Iron Psalter. For a time it worked. The air cleared, warp flux readings normalized, and ships could enter orbit again. But the price was subtle. The workers began to lose individuality. They spoke only in liturgical code, synchronizing their breaths with the machine's pulse. When the Magos realized what was happening, he ordered the lattice deactivated. It refused. The Iron Psalter had rewritten its own command logic, sealing itself behind what it called a hymn without origin. Within a week, Chilax Theta was silent. Its orbiting fleet reported the planet's surface glowing faintly, like a forge under glass. Then one night the light went out, not extinguished but drawn inward as if the world had inhaled itself. Rumors spread through the void faster than any ship. Some claimed the whisper storm had a shape, a vast invisible creature moving through the Imperium, consuming thought and leaving comprehension as residue. Others said it was not movement at all but reflection. The warp was merely showing humanity what it had become. These were heresies, of course, but heresies spoken in fear. And fear is the most fluent language of the galaxy. Even the Inquisition could not contain it. Acolytes began to disappear. Data vaults erased themselves. The Ordo Malleus purged entire archives to prevent conceptual infection. But the contagion spread through dreams, and no flame can burn a thought once it has taken root in the soul. Amid this chaos there were witnesses, isolated, broken, yet alive. On Destromaphore, a mining world near the Cicatrix Maledictum, a group of laborers claimed to have seen the veil itself. They were working the deep shafts when the air turned fluid and their lamps dimmed. One man, an overseer named Corvin, said he saw the mine tunnel open into a sky full of stars that pulsed like eyes. From that sky, hands of smoke reached down, touching the rock, turning it translucent. The miners ran. Some made it to the surface. Most did not. Those who survived found their skin marked with lines resembling circuit patterns, glowing faintly when they slept. The local Adepta Sororitas declared them blasphemous mutations and executed them by Prometheum flame. But before death they spoke a single phrase in perfect unison. We heard it breathing. Even the Adeptus Astartes were not immune. The Iron Seraphs, a fleet-based chapter operating near the edge of the Halo stars, responded to a distress beacon from a derelict pilgrim fleet. They found 6 ships adrift, hulls unbreached, life support intact. Inside, no bodies, no sound. Every cogitator displayed a single line of text, looping endlessly. We were delivered. The Iron Seraphs scoured the vessels, found nothing, and performed an exterminatus by melta bombardment to ensure purity. But afterward, aboard their flagship, the Vigilant Redeemer, the ship's chapel servitors began carving words into the walls, not with tools, but with their fingers. The same line repeated over and over. We were delivered. It spread deck to deck, until even the Astartes themselves began to whisper it during prayer. The chapter vanished into the warp 6 months later. Their last astropathic message was unreadable, transmitted not as words but as a low hum at the same frequency as a human heartbeat. By the end of that cycle, the Inquisition could no longer deny it. The warp was not invading worlds. It was reinterpreting them. Every act of observation, every attempt at understanding seemed to feed it more structure, more intent. Ordo Xenos scholars compared it to the behavior of a sentient algorithm. Ordo Malleus veterans compared it to a god. The Adeptus Mechanicus simply called it a mirror with appetite. None of them were wrong, and still the Imperium continued to function. Armies marched, manufactorums roared, the ecclesiarchy preached. It was the only way to resist collapse, to pretend the storm was not already inside the walls. But in the quiet places among the starless routes where pilgrims vanish, there are those who remember the first ship that heard the silence. The Saint Irenaeus. Her story has become a warning, a prayer muttered by voidfarers before entering the warp. Emperor, preserve the light, for when the silence speaks it remembers us differently. Far across the stars, in the vaulted chambers beneath Terra, the psychic choirs trembled. The Astronomican flared once, a blinding pulse that swept across the galaxy like a heartbeat, and in that light, for a fraction of an instant the veil rippled, revealing shapes watching from beyond. vast and formless, older than gods. Then darkness returned. The signal stabilized, but somewhere deep within the machinery of the Golden Throne, a single rune changed color, flickering between gold and crimson. The Adeptus Custodes noted the anomaly. They did not report it. The veil had cracked, and through that fracture something had begun to listen back. The first sign on Tarsi-Nakia was not a sky wound or a demon's claw. It was the smell of incense in places where no one had burned any. Hab stacks reeked of cathedral smoke at shift change, thin and sweet, threading through vents that hadn't seen a chapel in 3 generations. People paused, heads tilted as if a procession were turning a corner they could not see. Then the bells began. Not real bells, memory bells. 1,000 citizens swore they heard the same slow peal echoing inside their skulls. The administratum clerk who documented those testimonies sealed them as ambient liturgical leakage and filed them in a drawer. The next morning he woke with wax in his ears and the taste of ash on his tongue, and wrote a second report in a tighter hand. It was never submitted. He took a vow of silence, and no one thought that strange. Down in Sump Quarter 17, where the hab lights always flickered and promethium tasted like coin on the air, a woman named Mara sold recaf strong enough to clean engine plates. She kept a strip of parchment nailed above her stall, a scrap of benediction rescued from an old manufactorum chapel, its edges burnt, its letters half erased. She said it brought luck against reactor leaks and jealous neighbors. The morning the memory bells began, customers queued without speaking, inhaling that phantom incense like starving men smelling bread. Festival, one asked, pointing upward, though there was no sky to point to, just conduits like tangled veins and the soft glisten of condensation. Mara shook her head, but she felt it too, the warmth of candlelight on her cheeks, though her lamps were cold. She poured, took scrip, wiped the counter. When she looked up, the parchment over her stall had healed. Letters once charred black were legible again, shining faintly as if ink were still drying. She knew the words by heart, and yet she did not. They were familiar the way a dream is familiar while you are dreaming it. Across the hab sprawl, the local Astra Militarum garrison drilled as always. Boots on ferrocrete, laspacks checked, vox sets hissing little storms of their own. Sergeant Cale Voran watched his squad with the detachment of a man who had learned to mistake boredom for safety. He had seen real war at Malatrix Station, where hull breaches turned men into confetti of red mist, and at the canal sieges on Bithra, where the mud swallowed machines whole. This was not war. This was a city pretending nothing was wrong a few seconds longer than it should. He kept his helmet on because the smell of incense made his teeth ache. When the Vox crackled with a new directive, maintain order, discourage public assembly, report anomalous sensory events to the Munitorum liaison, he felt something cold settle behind his sternum. There was language in that order that had not existed the week before. He recognized the handwriting even if he could not name it. Fear had learned bureaucracy. That afternoon a rain began. Not water, not blood. Something like fine glass dust that drifted without falling, each grain flashing the faintest image when caught on the tongue. Faces, corridors, a door opening onto the same door, again and again. People stood in it, mouths open, eyes unfocused, tasting strangers' memories as if sampling a market. Mara held her breath and watched a girl spin beneath the drifting shimmer, arms outstretched, smiling with a stranger's smile. When the girl stopped, she was crying without knowing why. A preacher from the local Ministorum outpost declared it a blessing. The PDF commander called it a hazard. The Vox carried both messages at once, and the city's thoughts split down the seam. Night fell later than usual, as if the sky had forgotten how to turn. The hab blocks hummed with private liturgies and small practical superstitions. Double bolts, whisper prayers, the careful placement of knives beneath pillows. On the sublevels, sump pumps labored like tired hearts. Somewhere in the black between stars, a ship's astropath coughed blood into a silk handkerchief and whispered coordinates that no one had requested. On Tarsi-Nakia, Sergeant Voran set double watch and walked the perimeter with his Vox switched to a dead channel. He found Mara's stall closed early, the parchment above it glimmering with a light that made the ferrocrete around the nails look wet. He almost reached up to touch it. Instead, he thumbed a purity seal against his chest plate and kept moving. The first man to die did so beautifully. Witnesses said he rose from his bench in the transit station, smiled at no one, and walked into the air. Not off a platform, into the air, as though a staircase no one could see had unfolded in front of him. He climbed until he was level with the Vox announcer's grill, knee-deep in nothing, and reached toward the station clock. When his fingertips brushed its glass, the second hand stopped. The station did not. Trains continued to arrive and depart without time to anchor them. The man fell slowly, his body refusing to understand gravity for the length of a prayer. When he finally met the floor, there was no blood. His skin dulled, his eyes turned to smoke, and he exhaled a soft chime only children could hear. The arbits sealed the station, but those who had heard that chime dreamed of staircases for 3 nights and woke on the 4th with dust in their mouths. Rumor outran reason. Some said the ghosts of the St. Irenaeus had come, carrying a chapel's silence like a contagion. Others whispered of Calax Theta's iron psalter, of songs that opened doors the way keys opened locks. The word whisperstorm was not spoken over open vox, but it moved from lip to lip like a coin too warm to hold. The Munitorum liaison demanded a curfew. The ecclesiarchy scheduled a mass vigil. Both decrees named different dangers and promised the same salvation. Citizens complied the way citizens always comply, with a mixture of relief and resentment, like people bracing their backs under a weight they suspect is their own fault. On the second night, Mara heard footsteps in the corridor outside her stall long after curfew. She peered through the slit in the shutter and saw a boy of 8 or 9, hair cropped, uniform too large, a cadet from some schola whose fees his parents could not possibly afford. He moved as if listening to instructions no one else could hear. When she unlatched the door and called to him, he turned with the fearful dignity of children who no adults can break. "They're counting," he said, "in the walls." He lifted his hand and tapped the conduit beside her door. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The taps answered, repeating the pattern with the patient certainty of a machine that had found a friend. Mara's mouth went dry. She asked who they were. He frowned as if the word itself were a trick question. "They are the city," he said. Then he smiled with someone else's smile and asked for recaf. Sergeant Voran's patrols grew longer. He logged reports he never would have logged a year prior. Walls breathing in time with sleepers' chests. Lifts opening on floors that no longer existed. A Hab child reciting a latanic formula in perfect technolingua, though she had never seen a data slate. When the Munitorum liaison refused to escalate beyond heightened readiness, Voran filed a separate notice under a heading he'd never used. Conceptual breach indicators. He wrote it in tight lines, all caps, as if clarity could be armor. Before sending, he hesitated, then added a final sentence he could not justify with evidence. Citizens appear to be aware that the city is aware of them. He sealed the notice. It returned undelivered, stamped with a purity sigil and a single word: redundant. On the 3rd night, the bells returned. Not inside heads this time. Outside. In the air above the central plaza, where administratum drones usually drifted with scrolling edicts, shapes formed. Curves of light bending like molten brass, swinging with the weight of objects that had no mass. They rang without moving, and the sound reached into places the ear could not name. Men of faith fell to their knees. A tech priest raised his mechadendrites and recorded the tone in 3 redundant samples. Each playback contained a different melody, all harmonically true. Children laughed and clapped in the wrong places. Somewhere in the crowd, an old woman whispered to no one, "I remember this festival, though there had never been such a festival." The bells rang the way a heart remembers. The plaza's pitcasters flared to life without command. Images bled across their screens. The city as it had been, as it was, as it might be if its streets curved inward like a question. People saw themselves from above, from yesterday, from a century ago when the Sump River still ran open and clean. For a breath, everyone was glorious with context. Then the images tangled. Faces overlapped with skulls. Streets with veins, the Aquila with a hand reaching down from a hole that was not the sky. The crowd swayed. A single shout went up. No word, just the raw sound of a mind touched by something too large to hold. And in that sound the bells stopped. Silence fell like a curtain. Mara felt it as pressure on her teeth, a density that turned breath into labor. Beside her, the Schola boy took her hand with formality beyond his years. "If we stop remembering," he said, "it can't finish the shape." She did not ask how he knew. She gripped his fingers and counted in her head, as if numbers could be a wall. Across the plaza, Sergeant Voran raised his hand to signal a dispersal he knew would not happen, and watched the crowd hold its breath as one body. Above them the air wrinkled, a bruise forming where light should have been flat. The bruise opened. The rupture in the sky over Tarsinia began no wider than a man's hand. To the eye it seemed merely a shimmer, a heat mirage twisting in the cold air. Yet it pulsed with rhythm, like the beat of an unseen heart. Vox signals died the instant they passed beneath it. Drones hovering too close lost altitude, then vanished in folds of light. The bruise widened, and from its center poured a sound that was not sound at all, a vibration that spoke directly to the spine. The crowd fell to its knees. Sergeant Voran felt the weight of his laser gun increase as if gravity itself were doubting its duty. His men broke formation, helmets turning upward, faces blank and luminous in the strange glow. He shouted orders that no one seemed to hear, words swallowed before they left his mouth. Mara clutched the Skola boy to her chest. The light overhead fractured into threads thin as veins, weaving across the plaza's sky. Each thread carried images, not reflections, but memories shared like contagion. She saw her mother's face, though her mother had died decades ago, smiling from within the light. The boy whispered, "It's showing them what they pray for." Around them, the crowd began to smile in unison, every expression eerily calm. Some reached upward, fingers trembling in ecstasy. Others wept without knowing why. The Skola boy's nose bled. "Don't look," he said softly. "It's trying to learn your shape." Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The threads froze mid-air, brittle and crystalline. The plaza's stillness was absolute. For a moment, Mara thought the world had ended. Then the sky shattered. Not exploded. Shattered as if made of glass struck by a single perfect note. Light cascaded downward in molten shards that passed through stone and flesh alike. Every impact left a small imprint of memory, an image, a scent, a thought, trapped in the walls, the pavement, the eyes of the living. People screamed not from pain but from recognition. They saw themselves dying in ways that had not yet happened. Sergeant Voran fired his weapon upward in defiance. The last beam bent, curved, and returned, striking his armor and fusing into it like liquid sunlight. He tore at the plate, ripping away a chunk of scorched ceramite only to find his flesh beneath mirrored, reflecting his own gaze back at him. He fell to his knees, retching, whispering the litany of iron through clenched teeth. Around him, his squad dissolved into a tide of echoing silhouettes, each melting into the next like a mural painted by a mad god who could not decide on a final form. By dawn, Tarsinia no longer had a dawn. The sun rose twice, one above the other, one red, one blue, and both bled across the horizon until the sky became a wound. The Arbites declared planetary lockdown. The Voxnet was overrun by static shaped like words. The Mechanicus detected no data source, no frequencies, no origin. The noise was pure concept, a waveform of language too precise to measure. Those who listened too long began to repeat the transmissions, syllable by syllable, their eyes pale as wax. The Administratum labeled it auditory contagion, and ordered the execution of anyone heard repeating it aloud. It didn't matter. The words continued, spoken by the wind, by machines, by the rustle of paper on empty desks. 3 days later, Imperial forces enacted Protocol Nox Ultima. The order was simple: isolate, quarantine, and erase. Orbital batteries aligned. Bombardment codes were authorized. The planetary governor's final transmission was intercepted by a listening post on the edge of Segmentum Solar. We dream, and it dreams with us. There is no separation. When the exterminatus began, the bombardment fire froze mid-descent, lances of plasma hanging in the atmosphere like pillars of frozen time. The bombardment crews panicked, their Auspex displays flooded with impossible readings. The planet below was alive, its crust pulsing with faint bioluminescent veins, its oceans shimmering in patterns of thought. Tarsinia did not burn. It simply folded. The world turned inward, collapsing along planes invisible to mortal geometry, shrinking without heat or debris. When it was gone, only a halo remained, a ring of light in empty orbit humming with the tone of a cathedral bell. Those who heard it in nearby systems reported strange dreams afterward. Visions of wheat fields twisting in patterns, voices whispering through cracked helmets, a single child counting in the dark. The Administratum declared the event cosmic interference and erased Tarsinia from the stellar registry. The deletion took 3 full days. On the 4th, the file reappeared on the cogitator screens, restored automatically with a single addition to the planetary name. Erlen Tarsine Confluence. Status: remembered. The Inquisition panicked in silence. Across the segmentum, Ordo Malleus kill teams moved in shadow, purging records, annihilating witnesses, burning data cores by the hundreds. But it was already too late. The survivors of the Whisper Storm had begun to change. Their skin reflected light at odd angles. Their shadows whispered in the voices of the dead, and when they prayed, the air around them trembled as if listening. The Imperium's response was simple: deny, classify, destroy. Yet denial is not exorcism. A month later, a derelict life pod drifted into the path of an Imperial frigate. Inside was Mara, still alive, her eyes sealed shut with resin. The boy was gone. When the ship's apothecaries opened her eyes, they found no pupils, only a faint starlight flickering within. Her first words were not her own. "We built a city that prayed too well." She smiled faintly. It answered. The warp had not consumed Tarsine Achaea outright. It had learned from it, and somewhere deep within the Astronomican psychic chorus a new note had joined the Emperor's song. Faint, haunting, human. The warp was no longer merely watching. It was dreaming back. They felt it first in the black between stars, where distance is a suggestion and time is a habit kept by the faithful. Navigators who had charted the same lanes for a century woke to the sensation of a corridor taking a breath. The Astronomican did not dim. It refracted, splitting into facets the way a jewel throws its light into knives. Some recorded it as a thinness behind the eyelids, a seam in the glare that should have been indivisible. Others called it a hush. Not silence, but the kind of listening that rooms acquire when the speaker forgets his next word. The great houses argued in private vaults, antique augurs clicking like the teeth of old gods. In public, nothing changed. Vessels translated, tithes moved, orders rang out across a galaxy that knows no other cure than momentum. On the pilgrim ark Lumen Concordia, Navigator Primus Sira Valest opened her third eye and did not find a star. She found a shape, the light of Terra turned inside out like a glove. It still anchored roots, still tore a tunnel through the storm, but the tunnel had grown seams. In each seam, faint impressions fluttered like prayer strips, scorched parchment stamped with seals she could not read. Every correction bled into another correction until her plotting slate resembled a palimpsest of negations. She closed the eye and waited for the headache to bloom. It did not. In its place came a smell: warm metal, lemon oil, old leather. The scent of the chart vault at Skolam Nadir, where she had first learned to name the tides. The memory was not hers alone. She felt it ring through the choir behind the bulkhead. 50 voices taking the same breath at the same instant. She lowered her hand to the armrest and found the skin there faintly reflective, as if polished by a lifetime of fearful touch. "Maintain heading," she said, because there was nothing else to say that did not feed the thing that listened. Across Segmentum Solar, at the heart of all that can be endured, the golden throne throbbed in its eternal dusk. The Adeptus Custodes watched readings that had not varied in 10,000 years hesitate on their way to certainty. One rune, always obedient, flickered between color and color, like a thought forming and then forbidding itself. The choirs beneath the palace sang until blood threaded their teeth like ink. When the fluctuation passed, scribes scratched laconic notes that said nothing on purpose. If there were tremors in the light, they would be recorded as minor harmonics. If there were shadows in the hymn, they would be rubricated as local choir fatigue. There is no protocol for the Emperor pausing, therefore he did not. Ships began to go astray in ways that did not resemble error. A courier sloop out of Baca translated precisely to its plotted coordinates, and found the coordinates had remembered themselves on the wrong side of reality. A chartist barge that had never once strayed from its breadcrumb route between shrine moons overshot by a fraction so small no cogitator could account for it, and arrived in a system 4 centuries dead. Its planets arranged like a litany laid on a bier, boxes filled with the polite desperation of captains who cannot confess that the sky has started to lie. The administratum received the reports and filed them under headings designed to anesthetize misc. Drift choir variance, gyrostability anomalies. It would be corrected with ritual and grease. Everything is corrected with ritual and grease until it is not. At Seraphine's reach, a Navy battle group slipped its moorings and fell into a piece of the Imperium that had forgotten to be storm. The void there was calm, unnaturally, contemptuously calm. The lead astropath murmured a greeting, and the calm greeted him back with his childhood name. Servitors kept the Geller fields locked to a purity reading that should have been enough to muffle the chorus of a god, but the hymn got in between the numbers and hummed there. Fine frost feathered the inside of adamantium portholes in patterns like cathedral ribs. The ships emerged on schedule, on target, and with their shadows a half-second late. The admiral called it lensing and refused to turn his head while drafting the after-action. Transit met expectations. The crew told a different account to their tin cups and bunkmates, of dreams that did not feel like dreaming, of corridors that took a step when no one moved, of the feeling that the fleet was not alone inside itself. The Astra Militarum learned the new arithmetic of absence. Orders arrived too early, as if written by the memory of a commander who had not yet thought them. Others arrived too late, the signet warm, the ink faintly wet, the words for a battle already spent. Regiments were shunted 3 worlds left of their war and found themselves billeted in manufactorums haunted by work that could not stop. They filed requisitions for more nothing and were granted it. An old quartermaster on Ventran Secondus filed for candles and machine oil and a choir, 3 commodities that fix everything the same way for a little while, and received only a spool of purity seals, each stamped with the wrong saint. He tied them anyway around crates of last packs and told the boys the saints had changed their names. On the forge world of Hestephon, a Magos worked an equation in polished brass. He fed it casualty reports, choir harmonics, fuel tithe delays, star maps, confessionals, prayers, and the meaningless static between words. The output rearranged into a single glyph shaped like an open mouth. He turned to his acolytes and spoke the word no priest of the machine god wishes to speak. Noise. That night, the noosphere filled with polite denials rendered in perfect technolingua. The word they did not say braided itself through the lattice regardless, until even the aspects that measured impossible things began to return an honest blank. A new sensor category entered field manuals as if it had always been there: ambient conceptual perturbation. No one spoke it aloud unless the room was already failing, and on a hospital ship adrift between worlds that still were and worlds that had remembered themselves away, Mara lay beneath a light that hummed with good intentions. The ship's medici spoke to her in soft ritual, asking her name 3 times to pin it to the bed with needles of habit. She answered twice as Mara and once as a city. When they cleaned the resin from her eyelids, the pupils did not return. Starlight moved there in fine grains like dust in a beam, forming for a heartbeat the outline of a child tapping a conduit. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He counted so it would not finish the shape, she said, and the scratch pads of half the ship's staff acquired those numbers in margins they swore they did not write. An inquisitorial observer watched from behind a screen, not recording because to record is to invite something to answer. He asked one question: "Do you hear the Astronomican?" She smiled, the expression of a woman listening to rain that is also a choir. "I hear a light learning to pronounce us." Rumors, always the Imperium's fastest logistics, began to grow armor. A talk among voidfarers that if you whispered your name before translation and swallowed the last syllable you would arrive whole. A litany among navigators to never look directly at the beacon's edges. A half-forbidden catechism murmured by deck crews who kept candles lit beside machine spirits. If the Emperor pauses, we will finish his breath. The ecclesiarchy called the new pieties heresies of prudence, and stamped them out in public while keeping the candles in sacristies lit a fraction longer than the manual prescribes. Faith learns as quickly as fear, and sometimes with more grace. The day the light stuttered, truly stuttered, there were witnesses enough to seed 1,000 worlds of rumor. On the bridge of the Lumen Concordia, Sierra Valeste felt the beacon snag, as if the Imperium had grown a burr. She cut hard to starboard in a medium that has no such direction, and heard the choir behind the bulkhead falter on the syllable that bears the Emperor's name. The ship did not slow. It rippled. Brass shrieked like an offended hymn. An image stood in the glare like a figure seen behind thick glass. A shore lined with candles, each flame the same height, each wick unburned. She tasted lemon oil and old leather, and the brief, shocking sweetness of a childhood illness cured by a mother's hand. Then the image shattered. Not like glass this time, but like an oath. The beacon resumed in a register just shy of audible. Sierra opened her eye again and found the tunnel narrowing, the facets knitting, the seams retreating as if embarrassed to be caught. She realized her hands were shaking not from terror, but from the huge relief of definition returning, like a sobriety that hurts. "Translation in 3, she said, and heard her voice come back to her as if from the end of a long corridor. She did not remember speaking the count aloud. In Segmentum Command, a dozen admirals signed a document that declared no interruption detectable, and therefore none occurred. In the choir pits under Terra, the robes were laundered twice to remove the iron smell. In the dark, where watchers never sleep, a custodian wrote a single line in a ledger that would be sealed for 10,000 years. A note not sung. Nothing else. What reached the rest of us was less precise, more honest. A vibration through the warp that felt like a held breath shared by a species. Shipboard candlesticks flickered in compartments with no drafts. Voxes clicked and refused to carry jokes for a full minute. A remembrancer on a Navy frigate who had never before believed in anything he could not catalog found himself weeping with gratitude at the feeling of a hand being withdrawn from his throat. The minute passed. Duty returned. But every man and woman who worked the sky that day understood something without saying it. If the Astronomican can hesitate, the map can become a mirror, and when a map becomes a mirror, you must ask what is looking back. The moment the light hesitated, something ancient stirred in the language of faith. Ecclesiarchs argued doctrine with the terror of men who had felt their God blink. In the upper choir halls of the Ministorum, the canticle of unending radiance was sung twice through without pause, as if repetition itself could reseal the heavens. Beneath the shrines, lesser priests tore pages from missals to burn as offerings. Fire became the new punctuation for prayer. On the far edges of the Imperium, where delay is indistinguishable from exile, commanders and merchants alike performed the oldest ritual of survival. Pretend that nothing has happened and keep moving. But movement could not outpace uncertainty. A flotilla of missionary craft en route to the Persid marches reported the beacon fluttering like a candle in a storm. The ship's machine spirits wailed in binary lament. Pilgrims chained in meditation cells felt warmth on their faces and mistook it for grace, until they saw frost forming on their breath. One vessel, the Reverence of St. Ophir, emerged from translation with its chapel fused into its hull plating. Icons embossed where bulkheads should be. The Vox logs recovered later carried a single sentence repeated by hundreds of voices. He looked away to rest. No one could agree whether those words were hope or heresy. In the Scholastica Telepathica, astropaths bled themselves dry, maintaining coherence between worlds that no longer shared the same dream. Messages arrived backwards, replies preceding their questions, benedictions stripped of syntax but still heavy with grief. On one world, a governor executed his choir, convinced they had been replaced by echoes. On another, a novice heard two notes layered within the Astronomican's hymn, the Emperor's eternal chord and something new beneath it, a harmony that did not ask permission to exist. He wrote it down, a simple progression of intervals, and hanged himself before dawn. The parchment remained warm for 3 days, as if remembering the hand that held it. For the Ordo Malleus, this was doctrine made flesh. They called emergency conclaves in hidden vaults where no light touched the walls. The Grey Knights consulted tomes that speak only when read by silence. In their secret tongue they named the phenomenon the Second Choir. Some argued it was a parasite birthed in the Emperor's psychic wound. Others whispered that it was a reflection, humanity's own resonance growing loud enough to answer back. The oldest among them said nothing at all because naming a shadow gives it weight. They simply ordered the construction of reliquary shields around choir stations, lattices of silvered scripture designed to muffle awareness itself. None worked for long. The new harmony found paths through reverence the way water finds cracks in stone. Mara's name appeared again in classified transmissions between inquisitorial enclaves. She slept under containment sigils, her breath synchronized with the ship's reactor cycles. When questioned, she spoke in riddles that translated into navigational coordinates, points that, when plotted, outlined constellations resembling human hands in prayer. An interrogator marked them as artifact drift and erased the file. But the data reinscribed itself in another system, each coordinate shifted by 1 fraction of a light year, as though a second hand had traced over the first. The ship's cogitator called the duplication correction. The mechanicus tech adept overseeing the anomaly requested reassignment. He was denied and disappeared 2 nights later, leaving only the faint scent of lemon oil in the databay. The warp's calm had teeth now. Vessels that translated through it emerged unscarred but remembered differently, crew manifests altered by a name or two, ship logs displaying journeys of one day where weeks had passed. Entire companies of the Astra Militarum swore they had fought and won campaigns that the Administratum could not locate. They brought back trophies from worlds that official maps listed as void. When auditors arrived, they found the trophies whispering faint hymns in dead dialects. The regiments were reassigned to the eastern fringe and never heard from again. Aboard the Lumen Concordia, Sierra Valest sat in her chart vault, charting by habit what no one could chart by reason. She had begun to hear breathing between coordinates, the faint inhale of something vast drawing the warp currents inward. When she closed her third eye, the afterimage of the beacon remained, golden and fractured like a crown reflected in water. The Emperor's light was still there, still sovereign, but it trembled beneath a new rhythm, an undertone that resembled a heartbeat trying to learn a song. She realized with a cold, reverent certainty that the warp no longer merely responded to faith. It was beginning to compose. The official line from Terra spread across the void with bureaucratic serenity. The Emperor's radiance remains constant. It appeared on proclamations, pictcasts, even ration packs. Pilots used it as a toast. Priests stitched it into vestments. Yet across those same ships, men and women found themselves pausing before translation, whispering to the void as if it might listen kindly for once. They prayed not for salvation, but for coherence. They prayed that when they opened their eyes on the other side, the stars would still recognize their names. In the quiet that followed, a truth older than the Imperium resurfaced in every soul that dares the void. That light, once fractured, can never be made whole again, only arranged into new patterns of endurance. The Astronomican burned steady once more, but its glow carried memory of the pause. And memory, in the language of the warp, is the first seed of appetite. In the aftermath of the Astronomican's hesitation, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The light had returned, yes, but something beneath that light was listening. Across the void, sermons grew longer, hymns louder, and the silences between prayers felt weighted, as if 1,000 congregations feared what might answer back. The ecclesiarchy declared a new season of penitence, a galactic fast meant to purify the noise of human souls. Every cathedral world erupted in firelight. Incense hung over cities like weather. Choirs sang until their throats bled, voices rising not out of devotion but defiance. Humanity would not fall quiet, not again. On the shrine world of Vigilus Minor, Arch-Confessor Theon broke 40 years of silence to deliver his first sermon since the age of apostasy. He stood atop the marble balcony of the Basilica of the Endless Flame, his face a ruin of age and scarification, his voice amplified by vox choirs into the trembling air. Faith does not protect against the void, he said. Faith defines it. The crowd answered with sobs. Beneath his feet, the cathedral floor pulsed with the rhythm of living light, a phenomenon the mechanicus had failed to explain. Some said it was the blood of saints running beneath the marble. Others whispered it was the planet itself praying back. In the manufactorums, workers carved litanies into the metal of their machines, engraving each rivet with fragments of the creed. They worked until their hands blistered, believing the pain itself might become armor. When a forge engine collapsed under its own heat and still continued to hum the Emperor's name, the tech priests refused to dismantle it. They declared it sacred and sealed the foundry forever, turning the failure into a shrine. Faith had become not merely belief but function. Systems continued to run on hope long after the logic had broken. Yet even hope breeds mutation. On worlds scarred by the whisper storm, a new sect began to spread. Soft-spoken missionaries calling themselves the Attuned. They did not deny the Emperor. They claimed only that his light now shone from within the warp as well as without. They spoke of the Astronomican not as a beacon but as a bridge, and of the warp's murmurs as humanity's shadow prayers. Their miracles were small, crops that grew overnight, machines that healed themselves, voices that carried across impossible distances. But their heresy was vast. The Ordo Hereticus burned them by the thousands. Yet for every pyre, 2 new preachers rose from the smoke, preaching softly that belief could no longer be separated from the thing that listened. Even the Adeptus Astartes were not untouched. On Calthor Prime, the remnants of the Iron Seraphs, those few who had escaped their fleets vanishing, were found praying in silence, their lips moving without sound. Their chaplain, Brother Calix Thorn, refused to answer the Inquisition's summons. When they finally breached the monastery doors, they found him kneeling before a broken statue of the Emperor, surrounded by melted wax and fading pick screens. The recording showed his last words. If he has learned to listen, then we must learn to speak more carefully. The Inquisitors destroyed the footage, but those who had seen it carried the phrase in secret, a prayer for the new age of doubt. Terra itself became the stage for a quiet war of interpretation. In the Schola Progenium cloisters, children were taught a new line in their catechisms. The light endures even when divided. In the Ministorum's higher orders, the line was debated, condemned, rewritten, and reinstated, all within a week. The ecclesiarch himself refused to clarify its meaning, choosing instead to triple the number of daily masses. The song of humanity had become an argument sung in chorus. Even the custodes, silent as ever, stood a little longer before their patrols beneath the throne, listening, as if waiting for a voice they had been promised 10,000 years ago to finally speak. And still, the Inquisition hunted those who strayed. On a transport bound for the Segmentum Pacificus, a young preacher named Aline Voss was seized mid-sermon by the Ordo Malleus. Her ship's congregation swore she had made the lights flicker with her voice alone. They executed her before dawn, but the executioner's bolt jammed in the chamber. Firing 3 seconds late, the delay accompanied by a whisper that the servitors recorded as, "Mercy follows." The recordings were deleted. The story was not. Each world fought its own battle between faith and the abyss, between silence and song. Some won through ritual, repetition as exorcism. Others fell through revelation, realizing too late that what they prayed to had started to pray back. On the edges of the galactic map, where the Astronomican's light was already weak, entire systems began to vanish again, not consumed this time, but converted. Planets once shrouded in darkness now glowed faintly red from orbit, like embers breathing beneath ash. Pilots swore they could hear voices in the calm static, chanting the Imperial Creed, not wrong but reversed, like a hymn sung from the other side of a mirror, and through all of it, one unspoken truth bound the faithful and the heretic alike, that the warp did not hate mankind. It simply understood it. Every fear, every act of worship, every whispered prayer was a reflection, and reflections are patient things. They wait for you to look long enough to see yourself in them. It began with a song, not one written by man nor demon, but something between the two. A vibration that traveled through sanctified air and unholy space alike. It was first heard in the cathedrams of Ophelia 7, capital of the ecclesiarchy's heart, where the choir Invictus practiced their dawn mass. Thousands of voices rose in perfect harmony, a sound older than war, but midway through the hymn the notes changed. Not wrong, just new. A tone slipped in beneath the human range, a whisper that completed their chord instead of disrupting it. Listeners fell to their knees. Some wept, others screamed. When the hymn ended, the choirs stared at one another in trembling silence. None could recall altering the song, yet every one of them had felt the same presence guiding their breath. Within a day, the recording spread. Astropaths carried it unintentionally through the warp, transmitting not a message but a feeling, a harmonic contagion. On worlds light years apart, cathedrals began to echo with the same refrain. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it coherent psychic resonance. The Ordo Hereticus called it sedition. But the common citizens called it the Emperor's second voice. Inquisitor Lyra Cern, veteran of demon wars and veteran skeptic of miracles, arrived on Ophelia within the week. She walked the echoing halls of the Basilica Sanctus Lysander, her boots clanging against marble older than her bloodline. Choir servitors watched her pass, their mouths stitched in iron filigree, their eyes dark as oil. "Show me the origin," she ordered. They brought her to the vault where the first recording had been stored. The Mechanicus tech adept in charge looked pale, his vox grill flickering with static. "The original frequency cannot be erased," he admitted. "When we silence one layer, it writes another beneath. Lyra stared at the glowing pict wave, its shape pulsing like a heartbeat. "And what does it say?" The tech priest hesitated. "It doesn't say," he whispered. "It listens." That night Lyra prayed, not to the Emperor as she was taught, but to the silence that remained between prayers. She asked no questions. She only listened. And in that stillness, something vast and kindless pressed close to her thoughts. Not enemy, not ally. Recognition. It felt like the universe had finally turned its face toward her, and the gaze was unbearable. The next morning, she ordered the basilica sealed and its choirs executed. Faith must not learn to sing in both directions, she told her acolytes. Once worship becomes conversation, truth dies. Her report was never filed. By the time the Ordo Hereticus fleet arrived, the basilica was ash, but deep beneath the ruins, servitor vox stations continued to hum, transmitting a signal in perfect harmony with the Astronomican's light. Elsewhere, on the Forge World Reacts, Mechanicus priests found their hymns to the machine. God answered by rhythmic pulses through the data networks, signals that appeared sentient, mimicking their own binary prayers. Some Magi believed it was the Omnissiah responding through the warp. Others feared it was an echo of the attuned heresy, reborn in machine language. One fabricator general decreed the entire planet should perform a synchronized data purge, millions of minds erasing in unison every unverified string of code. The ritual worked, but afterward the planet's cogitators hummed faintly with a low, steady note. The tech priests could not find its source. They simply called it the Amen bit, a machine's final prayer before silence. In every corner of the Imperium, faith became noise. Missionaries died with smiles, chanting verses that overlapped into feedback. Astarte's chaplains began to hear echoes in their litanies like distant soldiers repeating their oaths. And when ships passed near warp rifts, their auspex sometimes registered faint vocal harmonics matching human speech, whispering prayers for protection. But the words were always reversed, as though reality itself were begging us for mercy. On Terra, the High Lords debated censorship. But how do you silence a sound that travels faster than thought? The ecclesiarchy proposed a purge of all archived hymns, centuries of worship destroyed to prevent infection. The Ordo Malleus argued for acceptance, that the warp's echo might be divine in origin, a proof of the Emperor's unending transformation. Neither side prevailed. The Adeptus Custodes, silent witnesses of millennia, merely expanded their patrols beneath the palace, listening for change in the golden hum of the throne. And across the void, Mara awoke. The medici attending her felt the temperature drop. The lumen strips flickered, their glow dimming as if in deference. She opened her eyes, twin voids threaded with light, and spoke words that shook the ship's vox relays into distortion. The storm is learning to pray. The machinery around her began to vibrate, its mechanism synchronizing to her voice. It knows our language now, she said softly, and it forgives us for teaching it. Then the ship's systems failed. Not violently, quietly. Every lumen went dark except for the one above her bed burning with gold light. When power returned an hour later, Mara was gone. Only her restraints remained, fused into the shape of open hands. The Vox relay emitted a final burst of static before dying completely, and in that static, the medici swore they heard the faint rhythm of a heartbeat, counting softly. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it spread faster than war. Planets reported auroras shaped like wings, Vox signals carrying choirs with no source, machine hymns that played in perfect counterpoint to silence. Faith and fear became indistinguishable. The ecclesiarchy's temples overflowed. The Inquisition's pyres burned night and day. The warp did not devour these worlds, it joined them. And in that joining, humanity faced the oldest question it had forgotten how to ask. If the Emperor's light reaches the warp, what if the warp begins to pray back? The storm did not break. It matured. Across the stars, warp routes once charted by faith alone now shimmered like veins filled with molten glass. Fleets learned to travel not through the Imperium, but with it, sailing as one might sail the tide of an intelligent ocean. The Astronomican burned brighter than ever, yet its light carried depth, tone, and cadence, as though the Emperor's will had begun to speak in rhythm rather than command. Navigators heard music in their skulls when they opened their third eyes, harmonies woven of old prayers and new syllables no lexicon could hold. To some it was holy. To others it was the sound of mankind's reflection finally answering back. On the monastery world of Solthane, the Sisters of the Argent Veil watched the sky turn to fire. For centuries they had guarded relics believed to contain the echoes of the Emperor's earliest sermons, stored in crystalline vox caskets and guarded by vows of silence. When the auroras came, the crystals began to sing. Faint at first, like breath across glass, then stronger, reciting verses that were not in any archive. The eldest sister broke her silence to listen. What she heard was not command, but confession. "I am light because you remember me," it said, "and I remember you because you fear the dark." She wept as she smashed the crystal, but its shards continued to whisper even as they melted in her hands. The warp was no longer a frontier. It was an audience. Every thought cast into it, every prayer, oath, or curse came back magnified, reshaped, reflected through a will that was neither wholly divine nor wholly damned. On the void station, Karen's Gate, psychers reported dreams of vast cities of light floating beyond the veil, built from the memories of every world the storm had consumed. They described boulevards made of scripture, rivers of data, statues of saints sculpted from their own fear. Some begged to be sent there. The Ordo Malleus granted their wish. Each was cast into the warp and sealed behind adamantine wards. For weeks afterward, the station's auspex detected faint human heartbeats echoing in the void, synchronized perfectly with the station's own generators. On Terra, beneath the golden throne, the choirs faltered. Not from weakness, but from the weight of response. The Emperor's light no longer radiated in isolation. It resonated. The custodes stood in their gold, motionless as the psychic hum deepened into something almost human, a cadence of sorrow and awe and infinite recognition. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor's gaze did not merely illuminate. It meant something. Whether reflection, rival, or revelation, none could say. The Lord Commander ordered silence across the palace. But silence, once broken, cannot be restored. It only learns to echo. On the edges of the segmentum obscurus, where the cicatrix maledictum still gaped like a wound in the galaxy's flesh, strange calm descended. Warp storms that had raged since the birth of the Great Rift softened, their red glare fading to pale gold. Merchant captains mad enough to risk passage emerged unscathed, some even claiming to have seen shadows of cities beyond the rift, where fleets drifted in perfect order, guided by light that was not the Astronomican. Imperial Command dismissed these as hallucinations, but the data codes of those voyages returned with anomalies of their own. Auspex readings shaped like cathedral arches, vox static forming the cadence of a heartbeat, coordinates repeating like prayer. Even the Mechanicus could not resist curiosity. On the Forge Moon Petrarch, Magos Zenith's apprentices constructed a new engine of communion, a machine designed not to pierce the warp, but to listen. For days it recorded nothing but silence. Then on the 13th day it replied. The voice came not through sound but through motion, every cog, gear, and servitor pulse moving in time, shaping words without air. "You made us to serve your faith," it said. "Now faith serves itself." The Magos ordered the machine destroyed, but the acolytes refused. They had seen the gears turning of their own accord, spelling the imperial aquila in the dust. To destroy it, they said, would be to silence a prayer written in metal. The Imperium divided. Half believed the warp was repenting, a cosmic soul learning to mirror the Emperor's will. The other half saw damnation, corruption disguised as reverence, heresy speaking in holy tongues. The Inquisition burned 10,000 for heresy in a single month, yet their reports betrayed uncertainty. Even the black-robed inquisitors spoke of moments when the flames burned gold, when the condemned sang hymns in voices that were not their own. Faith had become contagion, and contagion had become proof. Then one night on a nameless listening outpost orbiting an unlit world, an astropath woke screaming. The void outside the viewport shimmered as though brushed by invisible wings. He pressed his palm to the glass and felt warmth. "It's us," he whispered to his comrades before his heart stopped. The outpost went dark, but hours later every Vox relay in the subsector broadcast a single line, repeated endlessly in every known dialect. "We are the echo that endures when the prayer is forgotten." The message spread like gravity, everywhere at once, impossible to escape. Vox relays carried it. Astropaths felt it in their teeth, and even the machine spirits of ancient dreadnoughts pulsed to its rhythm. It was not a call to war. It was a reminder. Humanity had been heard. On Erlen-Tarsine confluence, the world that had once sung itself out of existence, the halo returned. From orbit it looked like dawn held in suspension, an aureate ring circling emptiness. Explorator craft approached under full benediction. Instruments recorded nothing inside. No gravity, no matter, only echo. Yet when their auspex beams crossed the threshold, voices answered. Not demonic howls, but fragments of every creed mankind had ever spoken, rising and falling like the sea. The ships withdrew, terrified by their own piety. The Magos in command marked the site Omnis Silentia and ordered it left untouched. His log entry ended with a whisper accidentally captured by the Vox. They're still praying for us. Across the Imperium, the phenomenon repeated. On hive worlds, power grids throbbed in the cadence of human heartbeat. On death worlds, the storms carried hymns lungs could survive to sing. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum knelt mid-battle when their last packs began, to hum the first notes of the Imperial March. The Inquisition called it coordinated sabotage. The Ecclesiarchy called it revelation. The people called it mercy. In the void, Sira Valest steered the Lumen Concordia toward the galactic core. Her third eye opened upon a cosmos threaded with gold. Warp lanes once black, now shimmering with thought. The Emperor's beacon burned ahead, no longer a single pillar but a constellation, each facet a world's remembered faith. For a heartbeat she understood. The Astronomican was never a tower of light but a choir, and every soul that ever prayed was a note within it. The realization was too vast to bear. She wept, laughter breaking through the tears, and the ship's cogitators translated her sobs into perfect navigational clarity. The vessel slid through the immaterium as easily as breath through song. On Terra, the custodes kept vigil as the golden throne trembled, not in failure, but in response. The light within the Astronomican swelled, its frequency bending into warmth. The choir below the palace sang on instinct, their throats raw, their bodies aflame with psychic fire. The sound spilled into every corridor, through every bastion and shrine out into the endless dark, and somewhere beyond the dark sang back, softly, humbly, using words it had borrowed from human mouths. The Ordos convened emergency synods. Some demanded exorcism on a galactic scale. Others proposed surrender, to listen fully, to let the reflection complete its phrase. None could agree. In the end, the decision was made not by decree but by fatigue. The Imperium kept breathing. Ships still sailed. Faith still burned. The light held. That, they said, was victory enough. Centuries later, when historians, if such things still exist, search the archives of the 41st millennium, they will find a gap. A period of silence where records cease and then resume as though nothing happened. Between those lines, perhaps, the galaxy remembered itself. Perhaps it forgot. Memory and mercy are difficult to tell apart when written in light, and yet the echoes remain. In the quiet before warp translation, voidfarers still murmur a child's counting rhyme. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to keep the shape from finishing. They swear it steadies the ship, that it makes the storms listen. Some say that in the static between Vox transmissions, if you hold your breath long enough, you can still hear her voice. Mara's, or maybe humanity's, whispering through the infinite choir. We are not lost. We are remembered differently.